want to spend some time, because the other big trick of those who support it, and I don't know how to shape this other than to do this next section. The argument is that the only people who, read the Journal Sentinel, listen to Secretary Evers. The only people who don't support Common Core are right-wing nut jobs. A handful of right-wing nut jobs are running around causing trouble. Well, let me show you, and if that's what I am, so be it. But I want you to take my picture with some of the right-wing nut jobs I'm about to show you. Okay? Study in contrast. The two chief lawyers at the Department of Education back in 08 and 09, the two chief lawyers at the Department of Ed. And can I say this? You don't get to be the chief lawyer at the Department of Education if you're a wing nut. You get that, right? It's not possible to be a screwy, out-of-control right-winger if the Department of Education makes you their chief lawyer. The two chief lawyers at the Department of Education both called this a federal takeover of education and illegal to boot. In imposing the Common Core standards and the test, and that's the last piece of that puzzle. What makes it genuinely federal? Besides the fact that only the feds can put it in, besides the fact that right now the feds are the ones punishing people who don't want to stay in it, besides all that, you got the tests. And you got the two testing consortiums. And where does all that data ultimately report back to? The federal government. It all goes back to the feds. That's the other thing, as the two lawyers are going to warn you, that's what really makes it federal. Because you understand this? He who controls the tests controls the curriculum. You teach anything you want in your schools. But how soon before your teachers figure out nothing you're doing other than what is on the test is going to matter? And that's the problem. I'll show you an interesting quote about that too. But our lawyers, in imposing the Common Core standards and the aligned assessments on the states, the federal government is violating 3 statutes that has put America on the road to a national curriculum. With respect to the Race to the Top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the Union. That would be the 46 that took it. Running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a nationalized K-12 program, and raising a fundamental question about whether the Department of Education is overstepping its statutory boundaries. Do you notice how those two lawyers who work for the Department of Education, they're not blaming it on the Common Core standard? Because the Common Core standards have no ability to do this. It requires the federal government. And it gets better. They say that the Race to the Top application, the initial scheme, vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states. Now I want you to pay attention to this. People say they're just standards. I agree they're just standards. Whether they're good or bad, we'll talk about in a minute. But it's the Race to the Top application that's setting the rules as to how you use them. And the Race to the Top program is absolutely federal. Who's in control of this program? Who's in control of it? The feds. The Race to the Top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states, requires that states adopt, this is a direct quote from Race to the Top, a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all the states in the consortium. This means states must adopt Common Core word for word. Race to the Top allows states, now this is going to say, okay, well that's a good thing. Race to the Top allows states to supplement the standards by 15%. This means that states must adopt Common Core word for word. States may supplement the standards, but only if the additional standards, quote, do not exceed 15% of the state's total standards for that content area. Well, that's good. We have to do 85% of what they tell us, almost like word for word, but we can add 15%. Well, wait just a minute here. If Wisconsin can do things 15% different than Michigan, who can do things 15% different than Ohio, how are they going to test that? Wouldn't they need 50 different state tests? And if they did that, it wouldn't be a national test, would it? They already said they're not doing 50 different state tests. So go ahead and do 15%, ladies and gentlemen. What percent of that 15% do you think is ever going to appear on a single test? It can't. It can't, right? And there are 3 states in the Union who had Common Core way longer than you have. They got a 2-year head start on you. You're really, to be completely honest, you're really entering your 2nd year of this. First year was feeding it, textbooks were being instituted, teachers were going to some professional development about what was coming. Then last year you really get the ball rolling. Well, 2 years before that happened, New York, Florida, and Kentucky, 3 states that all had it. Those 3 states have been tested for 2 consecutive years on Common Core. Not national tests because not everybody's in it yet. Prototypes of what the national test is going to be. Do you know that all 3 of those states now want out of it? All 3 of them. You got one very blue state, New York, one very red state, Kentucky, and a purple state, Florida, and they all went out to one degree or another. 85%, and there is no provision whatsoever in Race to the Top allowing allowing anything to be subtracted from Common Core. And again, I'm beating a dead horse. That dead horse is winning. You're going to walk out of here and you're going to hear it all over the state. This is not federal. The federal has nothing to do with it. We have autonomy. Do you not see this, right? The web that's closing in on you. And the fact that they even let you have, that's what happened in New York. Why did I'm going to say a phrase, and I want you to tell me what part of this phrase can be construed as conservative. New York State Teachers Union. Is there anything in that phrase that you could twist or parse to say right wing? They want out unanimously now. And why do they want out? Because they did it for 1 year. The tests were a disaster. And so they used their 15% the second year to teach all the stuff that to fix what wasn't working in Common Core. Then they got their second year of Common Core tests, and none of that stuff appeared on anything. That's why the teachers union wants out. You haven't had in Wisconsin your first test yet. You haven't had it. Like you're going to get it. You're going to get them next spring. Every state that's done early testing, it has been a disaster, and all those states want out. To one degree or another. Florida's trying to kill the National Testing Consortium, so they can't test Wisconsin, Florida kids. The New York State Teachers Union, as you'll see in a minute, the teachers union unanimously voted to halt the implementation of Common Core. All right, here we go. Let's just talk about this. Because again, the only meaningful argument I get when I make this talk is, well, A, you're full of it. It's hard to argue that one. The other one I get is that this is just whiny right-wingers. This is government conspiracy theorists. It's militiamen. It's preppers. I've got a big bunker under my house where I'm hoarding cat food for the big day. But I want to show you. These are serious liberal voices. They are not to be ignored. And notice the date. This is January 27th of 2014. The Board of New York's Teachers Union on Saturday unanimously voted to withdraw its support for Common Core state standards as they are being implemented and declared no confidence in the state's education commissioner, the Tony Evers of New York, who brought it to the state. The New York State United Teachers, a union which represents more than 600,000 education professionals in the state, is also asking the State Board of Regents to remove State Education Commissioner John King Jr. from office. And although it previously backed the Common Core standards, the union says it will not support the education benchmarks as interpreted and implemented. They won't support them. That's the New York State Teachers Union. But against that, how about the NEA? How about the largest teachers union in the whole country? Arguably the most powerful union in the nation, with the possible exception of the UAW. Although this union has a lot more members. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for Common Core academic standards, labeling their rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roekel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting some of the standards and revising the related tests with teacher input. Yeah, that's right. And the President of New York, the NEA is telling you what I've tried to tell you. The teachers did not have any input in this. 65 North Dakota teachers who looked at them after the fact aside, right? They didn't have any. And so the teachers are upset because, and you understand why the union's acting now? Because the teachers are getting blamed, not the standards. If the teachers don't get your kids to the standards, it's not Common Core's fault, it's the teachers' fault. And the teachers are saying, rightly so. If you're going to hang it around our necks, then let us fix it. Then let us write the tests. Let us edit them. No way Common Core will let that happen. But it gets better still. This is my favorite. That's February of 2014. Look at the date on this next one. This is May 7th of 2014, by my reckoning about a week ago. This is the Chicago State Teachers Union. right in President Obama's backyard. This is the most radical and progressive teachers union in the country. This is the same teachers union that 2 years ago voted in a curriculum that would begin teaching 5-year-olds how to masturbate. By all means, take my picture with them. Famous right-wing coups in history. The president of this union is Karen Lewis. Look her up. Just do yourself that favor. This woman is to the left of Bill Ayers, and if you told her that, she'd thank you. I'm serious about this. This is in President Obama's backyard. This is in a remarkably progressive teachers union. And she says things about Common Core that I'd be afraid to say. She writes, I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy, as well as into state educational autonomy. Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes standardized testing is designed to rank and sort our children, and it contributes significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in America's schools. Yeah, right. And not only did she, her statement is in 12 pages of joy. Go read it. But not only did she say that her whole union membership crafted a series of resolutions, and here they are. The CTU, right? Here's their resolution. It declares that, quote, instructional and curricular decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interest of their students. And the education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. In other words, the Chicago Teachers Union points out what I just said. It's developmentally inappropriate for kids. We'll see that in a moment. And the teachers should be the ones who write it and control it, and they had no part of that. Right? That's what she's looking at for. How about this? The resolution. Common Core standards were developed by, quote, non-practitioners. What I've been trying to tell you, right? Including test and curriculum publishers. You know who the second biggest donor to Common Core is? Private donor to Common Core is, because we know the federal government is the biggest donor. Who's the second biggest donor to Common Core? That would, outside the Gates Foundation, that would be Pearson Publishing. Pearson Publishing owns 100% right now of the Canadian textbook market, all of it. And right now they own about 80% of the American textbook market. The CEO of Pearson, a man by the name of Sir Michael Barber, has been buying, over the last 6 months, he's bought up about 40 different American small presses, paying 4 and 5 times what they're worth. He's already said he wants the same monopoly. Oh, and just last week, Pearson Publishing was awarded a lucrative contract to administer every single state test. They receive between $15 and $30 for every test American kids take. Now you multiply, depending on middle school tests versus high school tests, the difference in the pay. Now let's just call it $25. Split the difference. Right, $20 even. $20 times 60 million tests. What do you think that means? How much money is that? Right. Pearson. So not only did Pearson provide the vast majority of the textbooks that give the curriculum that matches the standards. That's the other thing nobody wants to talk about. You can't just look at the standards. Because what did the textbook companies do, particularly textbook companies like Pearson? They're the ones who rushed in before your states even had adopted Common Core. They're the ones who rushed in and began the publication of textbooks that conform completely to the Common Core pedagogy. Both Bill Gates and Michael Barber have both gone to the United Nations together, the two of them, to sign a contract to try to get Common Core into all the world's schools. Right? How do you set, what they want you to do is pretend, one at a time, don't look at these things. How do you not look at them? So, the Chicago Teachers Union observes, Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners, including test and curriculum publishers, and education reform foundations, such as the Gates and Broad Foundations, and Achieve, another David Coleman joint. Right? Where's this mic? It says that, quote, as a result, the standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of teachers and students. You know who else opposes it? That other bastion of right-wingery? The Occupy Wall Street. And why are they adamantly opposed to it? Because of all the crony capitalism involved. Right? Because It's been estimated that up to 70% of America's school districts will need either minor or major technology upgrades to be able to handle the kind of testing that Common Core does. Just out of curiosity, those computers do you think they're using to make all the Do you think it's accurate? You see the problem with this? Again, we haven't even gotten to the standards yet. Whatever you think of the standards, we're talking about them in about 2 seconds. But how do we ignore all this? How do we ignore this stuff? Here's a quote from Bill Gates from a month ago. You keep arguing you've got state and local autonomy. You keep arguing that you can do what you want. Well, listen to what the man said. When the tests are aligned to the Common Core standards, when the tests are aligned, the curriculum will line up as well. Now that's him. I didn't make that up. Go look it up. That's Bill. When we finally get the national tests in place, your teachers, your schools, your states will have no choice but to adopt their curriculum, their standards, their teaching to what the test says. That's Bill Gates. Now explain how that's consonant with freedom. Explain how that's consonant with state and local control. Explain how that's consonant with the way you want your kids educated. Do you know, by the way, as they're drafting, huge controversy, they're drafting them right now, these tests, and kids in New York and Florida have already taken them. The Common Core tests that your kids take come complete with commercials between questions. Advertising. Take a question, there's a little blurb from Pearson Publishing. Buy a textbook. This is all over the news. Right? That corporate sponsorship, logos like at baseball fields, now are going to be adorning your kids unless things change. As of last look, that's what Common Core was doing, having corporate sponsorship of the exams your kids take. All right, we have completed part one. I apologize, it was the longest part. But now we can talk about the standards, and I don't think you can talk about the standards without having all that in mind. Right? And I beg you to go verify it. You not what Karen Lewis has to say. Go ahead. Notice what we've done here, right? You've heard from the Department of Education lawyers. You've heard from Bill Gates from his own mouth. You've heard from the teachers union presidents and the NEA. Okay, good. Don't listen to me. Go follow what they're telling you. Are there other ways to look at this? Sure, I suppose. But I want to put to bed this idea that the opposition to this comes just from self-serving right wing. All right? So let's talk about the standards. Now you need one last little history lesson so I can start talking about the standards, and it's this. Common Core did something, the Common Core Committee did something that most people would otherwise see as a good thing. After Bill Gates paid for them, and after the standards were drafted and finalized by a small group of people behind closed doors, after all that happened, they created a committee, these people, called the Validation Committee. The purpose of this was to bring in some outside people to look at the standards that were written and to validate them, to give a thumbs up. This committee was empowered to change the standards or to throw them out altogether if they didn't work. The interesting thing about the Validation Committee is it consisted of 29 people. About 12 of them were activists, people like David Coleman. Another 8 to 10 of them were actually teachers, but they were 6th grade math teachers, high school English teachers. And I say respectfully, after I just defended our teachers, I'm going to say this. Just because you can teach 6th grade math or sophomore geometry does not mean you have the skill to write a national standard in math. So they brought in some low-level teachers who had no curriculum writing experience. And they only brought in one math expert and one English expert to validate the standard benefit. One serious math professor and one serious English professor. That was it. And by the way, those teachers I'm telling you, none of them had any serious expertise in either math or English beyond teaching at a middle school level. So they brought in one English professional, a woman by the name of Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She's considered to be one of the foremost ELA teachers in the country. She's retired now from the University of Arkansas, and she moved back home to live in Massachusetts. Sandy said of the English standards, and I quote, "These standards will set our kids 2 years behind, 2 years that are already behind the rest of the world, the high-achieving world, in terms of reading comprehension and writing." She voted no. The math professor was a fellow by the name of Dr. James Milgram, retired math teacher from Stanford University. Now, Milgram's a heavy dude. Milgram did most of the math computations for the Apollo moon shots in the late 60s. He's kind of a serious guy. And he said, and I quote, "It is an absolute joke to think Common Core math standards will prepare our kids for STEM careers, science, technology, education, engineering, and math, or even college-ready men." That was Jim Milgram. Both Sandy and Jim voted no. and wrote very long dissents as the two experts. They convinced other people on the committee to vote no. And the Common Core Validation Committee, when they finalized their document, they completely wrote out all of Milgram and Stotsky's testimony. They didn't mention them, they didn't include their names, they didn't include their objections, and they validated it without them. That's why Milgram and Stotsky are going all over the country talking about it. They're doing what I do. They're getting paid. Sandy, when Germantown pulled out, Germantown called Sandy and said, come talk to us. So they bought her a plane and a hotel room, and she came and she spent hours about a month ago sitting in a room with moms and dads and school board members from Germantown to help us put together an agreement. She testified, we brought her to Fond du Lac. Milgram testified in Eau Claire, right? They came here on their own. They were reimbursed simply for their travel. And Milgram spent, and when you go to that website at the end of this, you can watch both their testimonies here in Wisconsin. There's a great shot within Milgram's after doing all this math. He had brought all this math with him. So much so that being a humble English professor, I didn't know what I was talking about. I had a couple math guys. I would lean over to the math guy I knew and say, is this right? He goes, looks right to me. Milgram also points out, and this is important, Milgram said, there are only maybe 22 mathematicians in this whole country who could craft a national standard. And Milgram's not necessarily against national standard. He just said this one's a disaster. But there are only about 22 people, and none of them were ever consulted with them, ever. And Sandy did a remarkable thing. Sandy helped write the Massachusetts standards for English. Massachusetts is the only state in the Union that if you pull it out of the United States and put it up against the rest of the world in math and reading and writing and science, it finishes in the top 5 or 6 in every category, the only one. And when Milgram got done testifying, there's this great pullback of the camera after he's done, and you could just see all these state legislators with their hands in their heads. Right? Like, oh my God. And the same thing happened when Sandy testified. And one guy said, we've already spent so much money. What do you want us to do? And Sandy said, why don't you do what we did in Massachusetts? This was never done. You've got great universities in Wisconsin, she said, really good ones. Why don't you get your university professors to sit down with your education people at every level and say, as college professors, this is what we expect by the time you're kicking semester. You can say what you want about university professors. I know. We're lazy, entitled, right, overpaid, I get it, fine. But whatever we are, we do not want to teach remedial math and English and science. So however politically extreme you consider your professors, the fact is that if you sit down with them, they're going to tell you, we want your kids to know this and that. And what Sandy did, that's what they did. That was never done, by the way. None of that was ever done. She said, and so one of the, God, forgive me, for all the politicians present, forgive me, but politicians are kind of derivative in their thinking very often. And so one politician quickly chimed in and said, well, why don't we just take Massachusetts standards? And Sandy said, no, 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 because if you do that, and all 50 states take one standard again, you're right back in the same boat. Then some bureaucrat's going to come around and try to tie them together with a tax. Don't do that. You got good universities, use them. So Sandy, this chart is basically from her. She didn't design it, but the information is hers. And as an English professor, I feel really, really comfortable talking about it. What are the problems with Common Core English? Well, the mandates for Common Core English, both in the standards as they're written, and so you can't separate, in my humble opinion. This is where you might disagree with me. I understand it. I don't think you're right enough, but I understand it. This is where I have a hard time separating the actual standards from all the pedagogy and the textbooks that were put together. How do you separate those things? The textbooks were all put together before your state even had it to conjoin with Common Core. So what happens, we're in a weird situation now, where you're seeing all these absolutely absurd assignments in both reading and English. And whenever somebody pulls one of those out, the defenders of Common Core will say, well, that's a textbook's problem, not the standards problem. I don't see how you can separate it. Any more than I see how you can separate, given that they're all getting paid the same way, given that Pearson now is getting all these kickbacks, how do you separate this one of those things? As if they're somehow separate entities. Right? It doesn't make any sense. But Common Core mandates, both in the pedagogy as we find it in the English textbooks and in the standards themselves, it requires that up to 50% of the literature that kids have heretofore studied in English be removed in favor of informational texts. Now here's an interesting thing. This is where the collusion kicks in. Common Core standards don't require any books to be read. They didn't require anything. But what the standards did do is they put together a list of about 450 texts that they stamped Common Core approved. To me, this is a very dangerous thing. Common Core says, okay, we're not going to require any books, but here bunch of exemplar texts and the only texts that we stamp Common Core approved. Just an exercise in critical thinking. Of all the English textbooks out there, and I've looked at hundreds of them for Common Core, how many of them do you think include some variant of those 450 texts? All of them. It's really hard. And why would you? You're making your textbooks conform to Common Core. And the Common Core says, we're not going to make you read anything, but if you're going to read something, here's 450 books or texts, and the only 450 texts that we stamp approved. Which ones do you think the textbook companies immediately put in there? And so Sandy says that because of this, your kids are being exposed to a lot of information that is not literary in nature. In fact, it's downright political. These informational texts include things like President Obama's own executive orders and environmental pamphlet agency. And there's no critical thinking involved. You're not getting, okay, here are 3 pamphlets that deal with global warming and 1 that suggests that maybe it's overstated. No, it's all one-sided in the way it goes. And as Sandy rightly points out, what about the literature you're taking out? Why do we teach our kids to read through stories? If the purpose of a bedtime story was to put your kid to sleep, wouldn't you read him a Bill Gates computer manual? But it's not. When you read your kids bedtime stories, you read them stories that get their hearts thumping, that get their little eyelids fluttering. Why? Because we know kids bond to stories. And another thing, as Sandy rightly points out, by pulling out so much literature from English class, you're divorcing your kids from the 2,000-year Judeo-Christian history of our culture. By pulling out all that American literature in favor of highly contentious political texts, you are divorcing kids from a careful knowledge of the evolution of American liberty and freedom. You're contributing to a general ignorance. Furthermore, we know that and this makes sense, every test done by a professor knows this. Kids learn how to write well only after they first learn how to read well. But at every level of the curriculum, every level of standards, writing is reduced by about 50%, and reading is reduced by about 50%, and writing is elevated by about 50%. Kids are writing more than they're reading, and if you're a kid who can't read, what in the world are you writing about? And that's where Sandy's big concern about the kind of ideological issues that are being insinuated into the Common Core exemplar text, right? That's where you get the politics. These are, in fact, I'll show you. The big deal, you're getting much more indoctrination within texts. In other words, much less critical thinking. Critical thinking is not reading a bunch of pamphlets from the same ideological perspective that may be 1 grade above your reading capacity. That's not critical thinking. Critical thinking implies having to come to serious grips with multiple perspectives. And much, as Sandy says, less discussion of a character's moral and ethics, much less classic literature and more informational texts, some of them. So they're reading things like science and math and this kind of stuff in English. I guarantee you, they're not reading Moby Dick in math class. Science for freshmen and sophomores. Recommended levels of insulation. A report released in 2010 by the EPA and the Department of Energy. 10th and 11th graders. President Obama's own executive order, 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. Sandy estimates that about 35% of the exemplar texts deal exclusively with man-made global warming and America's role in destroying the planet. Unequivocally. A long essay called The Evolution of the Grocery Bag. Spoiler alert, paper and plastic are both bad, and America's contributing to the destruction of the planet.